Back in 1919, the world was picking up the pieces from the most brutal war anyone had ever seen. The goal? Build a peace that would last forever. But here's the big question. Did the Paris Peace Conference accidentally set the stage for World War II? Let's dig into the treaty that was supposed to end all wars and see what really happened.
And that right there is the question that historians have been arguing about for, well, over 100 years. To really get a handle on its legacy, we've got to dive into the clashing egos, the tough deals that were made, and of course the consequences that literally redrew the map of the world.
So let's set the scene. It's 1919. The constant roar of artillery from the Great War has finally stopped. Just silence. Millions are gone, entire empires have just vanished, and pretty much everyone on the planet is desperate to make sure something like this can never, ever happen again.
So the winners, the Allied powers, all get together in Paris. And their goal is, well, it's massive. They weren't just there to sign a piece of paper ending a war. Nope, they wanted to build a whole new world order right out of the ashes. Talk about an ambitious project, maybe even an impossible one.
But right out of the gate, there was a huge problem. The main guys in charge, the so-called Big Three, showed up with totally different ideas about what the future should look like. And it's right here, in this clash of personalities and national interests, that you can almost see the seeds of the next war being planted.
Okay, so the whole thing really boiled down to these three guys, and they were all coming from completely different places. First, you got Francis Georges Clemenceau. They called him the Tiger, and for good reason. He'd seen Germany invade his country twice in his own lifetime. So for him, it was simple. Crush Germany. Cripple them so they could never, ever be a threat again. Then you have America's Woodrow Wilson. He's this total idealist, safe across the Atlantic, and he's all about his big idea for a League of Nations to keep the peace. And then there's Britain's David Lloyd George, kind of stuck in the middle. He's trying to walk this tightrope. Sure, he wants to punish Germany, but he also knows that Britain's economy needs Germany to recover so they can trade. So you've got three allies with three completely different and maybe impossible to reconcile goals.
And this is so important to get. This wasn't just a negotiation over land or money. It was a full-blown clash of ideas. You had revenge on one side, idealism on another, and pure pragmatism trying to hold it all together. There was just no way the final treaty was going to be some clean, perfect document. It was always going to be a messy, complicated compromise. Okay, so what did this messy compromise actually lead to? What was the real impact of the Treaty of Versailles on the ground? Let's take a look at the evidence.
The treaty really had two completely different faces. On the plus side, hey, it officially ended World War I. That's a big deal. And it created the League of Nations. It also championed this idea of self-determination, basically that people should get to rule themselves. And because of that, new countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia were born from the rubble of old empires. But the negative side was, well, it was brutal. Germany lost a ton of land, its army was basically dismantled, and then they slapped it with the infamous war guilt clause, forcing Germany to accept all the blame and a mountain of debt from reparations. This wasn't a peace of equals, it was a peace built on punishment.
And that brings us to the first huge debate. With all these issues, did the treaty actually work? I mean, did it manage to keep the peace even for a short time?
Let's really look at both sides of the argument here. Was this a flawed but honest try at making peace, or was it just a ticking time bomb?
So the folks who say it was a success will argue, look, given how insane the situation was, it was a pretty reasonable shot. They point to the League of Nations, which was a brand new idea, a place to talk things out instead of shooting. But the argument against it is pretty powerful. By treating Germany like a criminal to be punished, not a country to rebuild with, the treaty created this deep, simmering resentment that made any kind of real, lasting peace feel almost impossible from day one.
And that resentment, well, that leads us straight to the biggest, most damning charge against the Treaty of Versailles, the one accusation that has haunted it for a century.
Yeah, this is the question, isn't it? Did the treaty actually cause World War II? Did the very men trying to end the war to end all wars accidentally pave the road for something even more horrific?
Okay. So on one hand, the argument is pretty simple. The treaty was so harsh, so humiliating, that it created the perfect storm for extremist parties to gain power. A guy like Adolf Hitler could stand up and say, "I'll tear up this shameful treaty," and people would listen. But on the other hand, a lot of historians say, whoa, not so fast, that's too simple. They argue that other things were way more important, like the global economic collapse of the Great Depression, or the fact that the Allies never really bothered to enforce the treaty when Germany started breaking the rules.
All right. So where does all this leave us? Let's loop back to that very first question we asked.
Did the treaty create more problems than it solved?
When you lay it all out, the legacy is just incredibly mixed. What did it solve? It ended the Great War and redrew the map of Europe. What did it create? A legacy of bitterness and anger in Germany that would fester for years. What did it solve? It introduced the idea of nations working together in the League. What did it create? Well, you could argue it laid the political and economic groundwork for the next World War. It's a paradox.
Maybe the most haunting thing ever said about the treaty came from someone who was right there. The top French military commander, Marshal Foch, took one look at the terms and said, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." He basically called it a 20-year timeout. And tragically, he was almost exactly right.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Can a peace treaty that's written by the winners ever really be fair to the losers? Is it even possible to create an impartial peace when one side holds all the cards? Or does that human need for security, or even for a little bit of revenge, always get in the way? It's the fundamental problem of how to end a war, and it's a question the world is still struggling with today.